I'm going to be shifting into how we take a look at organizational change. We have a backdrop now of a foundation that shows dramatic upheavals, but we also have a solid tradition of organizational change right now. What I would like to do is challenge you based upon this history. How do we need to be thinking differently about organizational change and what we do for our internal clients or external clients, depending upon the role you have in the change practice? So let's talk about how we talk about organizational change. Too often we think about it as an initiative or a project. There's a discrete beginning and end. Rarely do we even take the time to coordinate or align multiple change initiatives. They just overlap each other, combine, run into numerous conflicts because they're set up as individual without often a lot of forethought. Too often, the change experts are brought in after the goal for the change has already been established or when they're facing resistance and need help. We expect resistance. Often, though, this is due to low involvement. We use a low involvement level of selling. We would like to tell people how to change. We know we can't do that, so we shift to selling. We rarely go into testing, consulting, or co-creation for involvement. There also is a challenge of who gets to define resistance and what is behind the resistance based upon the viewpoint of the person involved. We often talk about change management. While knowing that we can't manage change per se, we can lead the vision, we can manage the process, but it's also key to how to enable people to get involved in the process itself. We also have to question an assumption of what triggers change. This is a question that for years I had not even asked myself until Reg and I got involved and started looking at change models. And a key that comes up repeatedly is what triggers change. And normally what you find is there's a problem that is reaching a crisis. It's a reaction. Rarely is change addressed proactively. It is often a reaction because of delayed responses to evolving symptoms of a core problem itself. Even opportunities are often framed as gap closure, which technically is a problem in and of itself. So even after we take a look at what triggers change, we have to ask who gets to approve the change. This gets into the control issues in organizations, and that organizations often are not built for change, they're built for control. And within that control process, there's a delegation that's pushed down, and the problems are then pushed up for resolution at a higher level. Then there is control, but how we manage that control can help or hinder the change process. Change then is driven by those in power, those that are often impacted by the problems or the delay in resolving those problems can only ask for assistance upward, and those that are in positions of control then can enable the changes necessary to move the organization forward. This raises a question though. Do we still need to control people? Much of the organization structure and management itself is built upon 100 years ago and before of a group of people who have a little bit more knowledge that can organize work and then bring people in that lack the skills, but be able to be trainable to perform that work. Therefore, the organization structure and much of management is built around control. But As we've moved to a knowledge economy, as we've grown to more complex organizations, a key question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we need to control people going forward? This brings up that change is often seen as someone else's problem. While people in the organization may face the symptoms of the core problem, they're not in a position to necessarily resolve it without getting authority from above. Similarly, with the delay of change, oftentimes we need to bring in organizational change specialists. Too often they're brought in after the change objective has been set. Oftentimes they're brought in when resistance is already being encountered and they're being asked to help fix the mistakes that was made earlier. Going forward, though, if we want to be proactive in our change, what is the role of the change specialist? Is change maturity the answer? Using the ProSci example, you can see that most organizations have moved into level 4 with some standards. Some are starting to set up organization-wide change competencies.
Excuse me, Ra. Okay, yep. Great. We just got back your slides back. Thanks. It's been gone since the horse.
You're back where?
It's been gone since you had the resistance with the picture of the horse.
Okay, let me jump back a section. Okay, give me a section here.
It seems fine now.
Okay. Let me jump ahead.
So we missed all of that you're just showing now.
Oh, okay. Let me stop here then. Okay. Okay, the question is, what triggers change? And oftentimes it's a problem as reaching crisis proportion. And even if it's an opportunity and not a problem, the opportunity is framed as gap closure per se, which itself is technically a problem. We also have to question who gets to approve or who has the decision rights to approve change. This gets then to those that are in power, and the people that are often facing the technical symptoms of a core problem, they only have the ability to push that upward into the organization to someone who has the decision rights to initiate the change itself that is needed and recognized by the people in the organization actually trying to do the work. Change then is often seen as someone else's problem. While people may be encountering the symptoms, they are not in control to resolve it. They have to push it upward so that while delegation comes down, problems for resolution are pushed up in the traditional hierarchy that we have in organizations. This often then brings up the role of the change specialist. Too often, specialists are brought in after the change objective is already put in place. Oftentimes, they're brought in when resistance is already being encountered and are being asked to fix the problems that were done earlier, way too late to really get an adequate change process put in place. Going forward, though, if we start to think about organizational change as a proactive effort, what is the role of the change specialist versus being a reactive change process, reacting to a problem? The question then comes into change maturity. Using the ProSci model, most organizations are moving into change 4. Some are moving into change 5, but in both cases, there is some standardization, some centralization of what change is. We're still looking at change within the traditional hierarchy for the most part. We're not really freeing up the decision rights to initiate change. This creates a challenge then of what are we going to use for the future of organizational change? Are our current change models up to the challenge? And to a large extent, when you actually look at them, they're designed for episodic change that too often is disruptive because they're reactive. The change frameworks. In earlier work I've published, I've identified 28 different frameworks. These are for planned change, but they're not really a methodology. When you look at them, they're really a driver for success. For example, Cotter's 8 stages, he came up with 8 problems and a stage for each of the problems. By doing so, he created a framework for successful change, but he did not create a good methodology, particularly for change novices who don't have the background that we have about what the theory and practice of organizational change is. The resistance models are interesting, but they're really not very good proactive because, again, they identify generally what happens when the problems occur with a poorly executed change initiative or a change framework not being employed properly. Diagnostic models are also very interesting in that they explain where the problems are, but rarely are they used for sense making, if at all. Too often, they're really ignored totally, and a change objective is jumped at once a politically feasible solution is identified, regardless of what the core problem is and what comes from the model itself. There's only a couple of these. For example, it's coming out of complexity science in the Kuhn-Even model that starts to make sense making, but for the most part, the diagnostics are jumped over in most organizations going right to a change objective. Okay. Competency models also start to lay out what people throughout the organization, where you have leaders at all levels and an ability to proactively identify areas of change going forward. Those competency models are good, but it raises the question, how do we go ahead and bring up massive numbers of people into those levels of competencies that we need today? This then brings us to a question on what if we did change differently? What if we designed an organization that is built for change? What would that organization actually look like? Our old thinking is gap closure with episodic and disruptive change. New thinking, though, what if we can do routine, proactive change that is also purpose aligned? And the purpose alignment becomes critical here because we can't just turn people loose for change. If we decentralize the change process and go to distributed decision rights necessary to bring change about, there's also some necessary alignment needed to keep the whole organization from flying apart. This brings up the question of how can this be done? This brings us to the point of what are the requirements if we were to put together a change process for routine proactive change. What is necessary to tear down the bureaucracy that is controlling us and that is limiting us? The requirements for organizational change really are rather simple when you get down to thinking about the purpose of the organization. The purpose of the organization is designed to do work. The organization is not necessarily for control. So therefore, if you're going to get work done and do it in a fast, proactive way, we need to find a way in our organizations for more autonomy throughout the organization, distributed decision rights that is action-oriented across the organization. This responsiveness, though, needs to be purpose driven, so that even though you've got some distribution of decision making and actions starting for change, how does it all tie together with some type of cross organizational linkages or alignment? Okay. These three components then lay a framework for what we need as an organization going forward. Autonomy that's action-oriented, responsiveness that is purposely driven, and a cross-organization alignment that rethinks our current traditional hierarchy of how we structure our organizations. Okay. This then lays the framework for our discussions tomorrow, where we're going to be talking, same time as now, about designing the organizations that are truly built for change. In that presentation, we're going to take a look at a number of organizations that are using non-traditional alternatives to structure and operational control. We're going to see what we can learn from those and then how we can generalize that learning into a more proactive way of looking at change. This then concludes our show and discussion, and we will now open for questions. Okay, any questions? And let me see one. I see one here right now, and Reg, you could jump in. Humanocracy is a model. Yes, we've done quite a bit with humanocracy in discussions earlier, and want to go further. It's a good model. It's got good principles. The challenge I have with humanocracy is that it gives a good future state. It's built on a number of examples I'll actually talk about tomorrow. But the challenge is it really assumes a massive groundswell to bring it about. And it leaves a gap of how to bring that groundswell about. So what Reg and I have been doing in some of our work is looking at the humanocracy and figuring out how to get there, but how to get there with maybe a little bit more structure built upon principles. And again, what Reg and I are doing is talking about principles that drive the operating structure and behaviors without necessarily being too constraining, the end result really reaching the humanocracy desired end state, but giving a pathway to get there.
Can I comment on that, Ross? Ross, can I come in there for a sec?
Please do.
Yeah, one of the issues with humanocracy and many of the other models that are currently being set out as alternatives to the traditional bureaucratic approach is they tend to focus on trying to solve the problem of the management of the organization, which is okay if the organization itself is also different. If you retain the organization as one that's designed for control, all you're doing is reorganizing the control system as opposed to the organization's effectiveness in translating activities into work outcomes. And so that's just one of the areas where we try to differentiate between this difference of designed for control as opposed to designed for work.
Okay. CJ asked a question about change being emergent, proactive, reactive, accidental. I agree. And to a large extent, much of what we are focused on has its roots within complexity science and how to enable emergence and how to influence that through linkages and the communication that comes from linkages. So technically, it is possible. There are bits and pieces, and as Reg has said earlier, much of what we're putting together is already available, but it's available in bits and pieces and not really put together in a cohesive manner. So as we've continued our searches, we keep finding these pieces that say, oh, that kind of fits here. And after a while, it starts to make sense of how the individual pieces work, but how they work better when they're all working together. Let me see. I'm jumping down. Reg, see anything else? Some questions that come up? One question comes is, can change be managed? I say no, but the process that you approach it can be managed. What I like to say is you have to lead the vision for change. You can manage the change process, but the third component is that you have to enable people that are involved in the change process. Now, that still draws upon some bit of an episodic thinking, but you have to move a little bit further of how to distribute the decision rights to initiate change and the principles that guide that process of people taking that initiative themselves.
Yeah, Ross, there's a question here about if we start to change around the design and control versus design for work, then aren't we interfering with or changing the DNA of the organization in terms of its culture? I try to avoid the term culture and more talk about it as organizational behavior generally, because culture has so many different meanings to different people. But certainly the way the organization behaves will change. And that's one of the reasons for moving from an organization of control to work. Most people actually want to come to work, not to be controlled. And the effect of that change, as you'll see tomorrow with some of the examples that Ross gives, is absolutely amazing.
Yep. One of the questions came up here is the primary purpose of organization is to deliver value versus work. I can agree with that as value as an outcome, but you structure the organization and the processes to accomplish work so that that outcome is attained. So I think we're saying the same thing here, because without the work being accomplished, there is no value being generated. So I think we're talking at different levels of the same issue there.
Yeah, there's a question here about teams. Again, you'll find certainly when we on Thursday explain how we offer this very different approach, that the team is an important part, and we refer to teams and work groups in different ways. And so, yes, the team is an important component. It's another reason to free them up.
Rachel brings up an interesting question as a challenge to get leaders to see this. We agree. Reg and I have spent 3 years getting our head around this, starting from the problems of why after 20 years we keep talking about the 30% success rate. There's questionable statistics about that, but one I keep coming back to is McKinsey in their annual report of CEOs keeps coming up with about 30% of CEOs saying they are satisfied with the rate of change their organizations are doing. So that kind of supports it, but at the same time, that is a very narrow statistic, but that statistic hasn't changed over the years, in which case, as a profession, what are we doing wrong that we aren't seeing people jumping on board and adopting with more readiness what we believe is good change practice? It also gets into how we think about organizations and the people role in them. But the question of how do we publicize this going further is what Reg and I will be working on starting next week.
Yeah, there's another question here, Ross, which is, I think really important here, and that is, why is it that leaders are so slow, it seems, to see the need for change? What is blocking their foresight? I'm not sure whether their foresight is being blocked by not seeing things for change. When I talk to leaders, as I often do individually, they desperately want to change. You have to then say, well, how are they being measured? And depending where they are in the organization, they are being measured by achieving what their boss wants them to achieve. And that may be to keep the shareholder value where it is. If you bring in change, it's risk and you may damage our shareholder value and so forth. And so it's making sense of where is that leader in this situation? What is their world? And making sense of that. But I think this is beginning to change because society is now, as I mentioned about the globalization is changing. The whole concept of what work means for people is changing and so forth. There's a lot of pressure on shareholder value to change. And there was a very interesting article I read about that yesterday. It's even getting into the popular press now. So there is going to be this shift, and we can't wait for that. I suggest we've got to be ahead of it. We've got to be there introducing ways for them to cope with the shift that we know, because there are lots of things that are hard changes that we know are going to happen, and this is one of them. And the soft changes are the where we have the opportunity to really start working and delivering. And that's why we believe this is so important.
When you take a look at the slowness of executives, even middle management, to act, I think there's also some structural issues in that everything is up-down communicated within traditional hierarchies, which really fosters silos. And oftentimes change needs to occur at the boundaries of organizations between those silos. And it's very difficult to communicate the needs up when a person has to communicate up, then it's got to go over and then down to establish a team then to address the problem. There's also, I think, some built-in leadership problems themselves, and that there's an assumption that as people go up in the organization, they know more. In reality, they know more about the past, but they know less about the present because they're more removed from the people who are facing the issues. So there's also not only that remoteness, but there's an expectation that people know what they don't know. And there's some fear of them being vulnerable and try to maybe bluff their way or let people think that they know more than they know without appearing ignorant or having to ask for help. And when you take a look at the leadership development, a lot of that effort is how to enable leaders to appear vulnerable, but still get the information that they need without losing maybe their leadership qualities that they somehow demand for the organization.
Yeah, there's quite a lot coming through on leadership and the types of leaders and things like this. Okay. I think the whole concept of leadership is such a convoluted discussion. Everybody's got their own imagination of what the word leader means, and that is their history and their reading and so on. And if you take away the control element in organizational design, then we are changing the whole concept of how we motivate and empower people. And then you have to question, do we need leaders in the common sense of the word that people associate with the word leader in bureaucracies? Or do we now need a different type of person who isn't this stereotypical narcissistic know-all who is going to control how everybody does things, or the other end of the spectrum who is there just to see how things go? We need a very different type of person. And when we talk about this on Thursday, you'll see that most of the middle and senior management of organizations would struggle in the future, and they're struggling now.
Yeah. I think we also need to take a look at the definition of leadership and management. oftentimes are used interchangeably. Management is all about control when you look at the functions, and leadership's all about leading toward the future itself. When I did my doctorate work, it was in a specialization of leadership and organizational change. And I entered that study thinking that they were separate. But the more I got into both, I realized that leadership is organizational change. And it's necessary to really have leaders at all levels of the organization that understand organizational change for them to be effective.
There's an interesting one here, Ross, about stakeholders and the purpose of the organization and so forth. I can answer that one quite quickly. The purpose of the organization, as far as Ross and I are concerned, is the beginning. If you haven't got a clear purpose, and if you look at the value statements and all the other things of organizations, and we've looked at thousands, hardly any of them have got a real proper purpose statement. And so if you start off with a very clear why you're doing it, who you're doing it for, what you're going to give them and so on, then that's also a clear direction for the rest of the organization. And everything that's done within the activity of work must ensure that the outcome of that purpose statement is achieved. And it's done in many, many different ways. And so, yes, I agree with the comment there that the purpose is the key, and it's how we deliver that purpose has got mixed up over time. When we looked at the guilds and things like this, they had very clear purposes. And people reacted and worked accordingly. And the individual artisans, they knew what they wanted to do. They didn't need controls because they wanted the quality and so forth. Otherwise, they wouldn't be alive because they wouldn't get their foods. And so the purpose is the driver. And you'll see that very clearly over the next 2 days.
One of the questions also on change being a reaction to a problem, technically that is right. The key is how quickly you identify the symptoms and identify the core issue of that problem itself. And the problem isn't necessarily being reactive, as being slow. So the proactive part is identifying what's happening, what needs to happen, and get ahead of the problems, and more accurately, getting ahead of the symptoms building to a crisis itself and dealing with it much earlier. This gets into doing change quicker through reaction timing. And the problem that we see is that the organizations that we normally work in are very slow to react because of the structure and the operating policies and procedures.
There's one here, Ross, which I think is really, really key again. And this is very often organizations, they're non-hierarchical and they distribute decisions and so forth. But as they grow, then this breaks down because of the lack of alignment. And so control comes in and prevent divergence. Absolutely agree. Now, the key, and Ross and I can tell you, we've had so many hours of discussion around this area. How do you get an organization to stay like an entrepreneur that uses effectuation, and then at a certain stage it gets into causation and linear processes and things? And we really, really have gone into that. And the answer actually was quite simple. It comes back to what Ross said earlier. If we break away from organizations that are designed for control and we design them for work, you then have to say, right, how do we keep an organization that's designed for work aligned? And we think we've got the answer. So tune in on Thursday to see how we've approached this, because as I said in the history, there's nothing new. It's just a new way of viewing things and doing them slightly differently. And this is what we're doing. And the transition from one to the other is actually not that difficult if you are clear what your outcome is that you're trying to achieve.
One question that came up here deals with power, and the power that power has, as you might say, as people go up in the organization. But in Thursday's presentation, you're going to see a different view. that really releases people in new ways that they don't have to rely upon power. If you take a look at what they can accomplish, what they want to accomplish, if you free them to do that, then their need for power over others really goes away because it becomes more of a collaborative effort. They get more excited about what is possible within the organization. So it's a different way of really releasing people's passion, not only at the low levels of the organization, but also release people's passion at the middle and upper level where they can do the work that they really should be doing, but are too often encumbered by power issues.
Okay, I'm going to take issue with one of my combatants, good old Gary. Gary, you're talking about the future being unpredictable. I don't agree with you there. I think that there are some elements that aren't predictable, but there are some that are very clear that we can predict. And very often we don't even notice those because the management who are looking or supposed to be looking out for these predictable elements of the future are too busy fighting fires internally. They don't spend the time looking outside because they don't have it. And so that's another important part of the approach that we're suggesting is to get people to actually predict the future. And I'll just give you a very quick example here. When they were changing a law in Europe, one of my students actually identified that he had 2 years to create his business before anyone else would think about it. And so he did. And when that law came into being, he was the sole provider of the solution for that new law. And that was predicted for 2 years. Other companies woke up to it when everybody announced this new law starts on the 1st of whatever month. So there are many things we can predict, but we're not. And that's the challenge.
It also gets to effectuation, which comes from the theory of entrepreneurship. If you can get back to that, you're not necessarily having to predict it, but you're creating it through the possibilities that you enable by the actions you take today.
Yep.
So the key is to rethink and not necessarily go into it wanting to predict what will happen, but think about it as enabling what can happen and make those decisions that take you in that direction today. That comes from the theory of effectuation that we draw upon. The question comes of needing orderly change. That's an interesting question because if everybody is involved and there's some alignment, there is some order based upon that. Even though there's multiple moving parts, if they're aligned, that creates some order. The problem with episodic change oftentimes is that while you think the process is orderly, when you put that process in place, it becomes very disorderly because different parts of the organization are at different stages of where they are in the change process. They see it from different perspectives. They have boundary conflicts, in which case an orderly process may not necessarily lead to an orderly outcome of that process once implemented. And that's one of the challenges I think we have as a profession of how to, get so that change does have some order to it, so that people are aligned.
Well, there's another interesting one regarding leadership, about removing roadblocks and negotiate the way forward and fully enable and celebrate those implementing the changes. Does it need to be a leader who removes roadblocks? And what do we really classify as a roadblock? And this is, again, one of the many discussions that Ross and I have had. And so the challenge is to break away from the concept of roadblocks and look at them as opportunities And once they are looked at as an opportunity, we may not want to unblock them because it may not be the route that's the best one for us, and there's an alternative. This is where effectuation comes back in. Whereas if we look at things from a causation linear process, then we're going to see many, many roadblocks. And and if we go back in history over the decisions we've made where we've avoided or tried to break away from a roadblock rather than use it as an opportunity and examine how we made that decision and the reasons why, we can then find out that we could have taken a better route that would have achieved much more for us had we started to think differently. And so this is, again, what we're encouraging people to do with this effectuation approach, is try just to think differently. It's not saying in one model the leader should not unblock roadblocks, but in another model, it might actually be an opportunity to find some other alternative future, which may be better for the people involved.
The Kuhneven model has come up a couple places now, and I agree that it is an excellent sense-making framework and actually can easily be included in what we're doing, because a key function of what we're putting together is built upon how to make sense of the organization and take action upon that sense making. That becomes a specialized functional focus. So I would not eliminate the complexity science at all. I would totally embrace it because it has a key part in what we're advocating.
Yeah, really support that. And if you don't know what the Knieven framework is, then make sure you tune into Gary Wong, because I know he's brilliant at what he presents and the model is, and we have little challenges and skirmishes, but it's all around positiveness, and it's a brilliant way of approaching organizations.
Right, and Gary earlier last summer did some webinars for us, and I believe a recording of at least one of those is in the video library. But again, I encourage you definitely to attend his session. Yeah. Yeah, issue of risk taking is definitely a key part of what we're talking about, and actually comes into play when you look at effectuation of what is risk and how do you approach it. And this becomes very important as you distribute decision rights of how is risk managed or controlled to some extent within a framework of people initiating change in collaboration with others.
Yeah, I mean, in effectuation, this whole issue of risk is very, very different to causation. In causation, we try to reduce the risk in some way, or even hive it off to somebody else. And that's what insurance companies have been doing for generations, and what management tends to try to do. Whereas in effectuation, we approach it not recklessly, but looking at what we can afford, what is the amount we can afford to lose in this situation? And we take that as our benchmark for helping to make our decision. And it's a very different mindset, because it then again opens up wider opportunities. And this is what organizations of the future need to do now. We've got so much data coming in, we're drowned in data. But what we don't have is much information about what that means. And so we have to free ourselves up from this sort of Newtonian world and start thinking in a different way. And this is what effectuation encourages us to do.
Okay. Another question that's come up here on stakeholders, strategic goals, sustainability. Reg will talk about this specifically within the Thursday presentation of what is the role for different parts of the organization. And these are key roles that are identified. And actually, there's more emphasis placed upon them, because when you start to segregate roles for people within the organization, much more focus can be put on those roles when you eliminate the control and the oversight that often takes away from those people's time.
Yeah, I think it's important to stress that Thursday is not about giving you another model for an organization. which most alternative approaches tend to do. Basically, they're building blocks based on principles so that it's as flexible as you need to be for the different types of organization. You couldn't run a government department in the same way that you run care in the community. There are different pressures, different political imperatives, and so on. And so this is about building the appropriate organization for what it is you're the purpose of your organization. And it's not a specific model.
The questions come up as to whether people are naturally disposed against change and that they'll naturally resist change. I don't necessarily agree with that. People don't resist change, they resist being changed. And that's a critical component here of how they're involved in the change process. People like change that fits their agenda, that they're in control of. The key is how to enable them to have some control in the change process so that they're not feeling that they're being changed. And that's a very big mindset that is really at the heart of much of what we're doing.
Okay, I think these are a question that's probably in many people's minds, and that you can't take uncertainty and experimentation to the bank. And so you've got to have KPIs and OKRs to try and work towards them. I guess it again depends on the business. We're not suggesting that you take all the uncertainty out of an organization and innovation in every aspect of it. What we're suggesting is the way that most organizations approach it today isn't working as well as it could do, and the environment that they're working is changing so rapidly, they need to start to rethink. And so companies and organizations that are in innovation as a process, or bank organizations with very strict fiscal regulations and everything, it's just looking at both of those models at two ends of the spectrum to say there are other ways of doing it. You don't have to, but look at how successful you can be if you start to think differently. And that's all we're offering here. It's not a one size fits all, far from it.
One question comes is, would you consider purpose the same as value delivery? I guess in a way.
Doesn't it depend on the organization?
Yeah.
I guess it comes back to the original statement. What is the purpose of the organization? Some organizations are about delivering a product, others about a service, and varying services from personal services of just support and counseling and listening through to technical engineering. And so I would suggest that it comes from that route. Whatever the purpose of that organization is, then defines the rest. Okay, I mean, there's another one here about the purpose of the organization is set by its stakeholders, not the organization itself. I guess the purpose is set by whoever is owning it. If the stakeholder here means shareholders and people like that, then of course they will have a say in the purpose of the organization. For me, it doesn't matter where that purpose is defined. That's an internal battle. Once it's defined, it's then you take that purpose and move forward. Whether it's shareholders, government stakeholders in the public sector, for example, keep redefining the role of the health service and the police and so forth. That's outside of the organization's remit. But once you've got that purpose, then it's down to the people running it, I would suggest.
It also gets down to how is the purpose formed? And if you take a look at the stakeholders from the wide perspective of not only the employees, the customers, the ownership, but everybody else who is impacted in any way by the organization, you can to some extent see that the purpose evolves over time as the stakeholders' interest evolve relative to that organization. So this purpose isn't necessarily locked in place. It's an evolving entity to meet the needs of the collective stakeholders.
I'm time-wise, Ross.
We're basically over our time. I still see we've got 58 people on board. I'm still going through the questions.
Yeah. I mean, Ross and I don't agree on everything. And I part company with him a little bit on the evolving purpose. I think the purpose is pretty rigid. What may evolve is what that means for the organization in my world. But again, we don't have to agree on everything.
No, I'd probably agree with that. I think we're talking timing and the over the scope of the time of when you look at purpose.
Yep. Okay, do you want to tell them what you're doing tomorrow, Ross?
Okay, tomorrow's session, which will begin at the same time as this session, we're going to do a dive into non-traditional organizations. Many of those are actually listed in the Humanocracy book itself. We're going to look at what they do, but from a perspective of what is really beneficial to the organization and how they approach their work and change, and maybe where some of the limitations are. And then from that, distill down a set of principles that we can then use for designing organizations that are built for change. And that's a key component because these non-traditional organizations are doing things rather different. And we're trying to then promote what they're doing, but also where there's some problems in what they're doing and how we might overcome that. When you look at the collection of multiple entities, you come away with a little different viewpoint of looking at each one individually. That's tomorrow's discussion. Then after that, we'll go more into how do you take those principles into design. And then that will eventually follow with our final presentation prior to the Wonder Room discussion of how to pull it all together. Anything else at this time, Reg?
Not from my side, no. I know some people have got other things to do and watch, and so I think we've covered most of what people have said or asked.
Yeah. Any other questions that come up, we will reply to the questions that are put on this event. Also, please go to the Change as a Business Model subgroup where we can go deeper into this. If you've got questions that aren't answered or aren't answered in the forthcoming presentations. Okay. Anything else for today?
No, I'll just finish on one comment here.
Okay.
That many people consider change as what happens to them. It happens to all of us. We're all involved. And I think that's the important part of what we're trying to do here is get everybody in the organization involved in what it means, how it works, and to show that they all have an important part and a lot of control over what happens.
Okay. I did see someone bringing up Otto Schumer's transformative change work. There's actually a presentation on the Theory U coming up, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Anything else, Reg, or you want to just call it a day and we'll...
No, thank you for joining us, and I hope it's beginning to make some sense to some of you. I hope not to all of you, because I look forward to a great debate in the Wonder Room so we can challenge each other's assumptions, because that's what life's about, isn't it? It's about challenging how we view each other's views in a positive way so that together we can find a good way forward. So thanks very much for joining in, and I look forward to tomorrow.
Yeah, let me restate that we do enjoy being challenged, because for the past 3 years, Reggie and I have challenged each other greatly. And now we're looking for more insights as to how we can fill in some of the gaps in our thinking and how it all comes together. Thank you for your time today. Looking forward to more engagement in future presentations, as well as in the discussions on the Change Management Network. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.